Welcome to part 1 of this 3-part tutorial series where we'll be creating these procedural terrazzo tile materials. So because this is going to take a while to create all 6 different materials, I've decided to break up this tutorial into 3 parts. So in part 1 we're going to be creating these 2 materials, then in part 2 we'll be creating these 2, and then the final part we'll be creating these 2 materials. Now if you'd just like to quickly get access to these materials so you can use them in your projects, then you can purchase the project files on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, and also the Blender Market. I'll have the links in the description. And all of these materials are joined together into custom node groups, so once you apply the material to your object, you can change all the settings to customize the material. Or of course you can watch all 3 parts of the tutorial and learn how to create the materials yourself. You can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to purchase all of my materials, and my Ultimate Material Pack comes with all of my materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And I also update my Ultimate Material Pack every time I create 10 more procedural materials. You can also purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And to learn how to create more procedural materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist here on YouTube. The links are in the description. Now something that I did want to mention about this tutorial is I am going to be copying some of the node data from one material over to other materials. And that's because many of these materials are created similarly, so the node setup is pretty similar, but I just changed some of the settings to make the material look different. And so by copying the data and then just changing some of the settings of the material, it'll really speed up the process for creating all of these. So I just wanted to let you know about that, because if you're wanting to create one of these node groups, I'm not going to create them all individually. I'll be copying some of the data from the other materials. So if you want to jump straight to the tutorial, then you can use the timestamps in the video description and in the YouTube timeline, but I'm going to go through here and I'm going to show you all the different custom node groups. So we first have the terrazzo tile 1, and for this one we have the scale of the material. Then we also have the tile scale, just to change the scale of each one of those tiles. Then we have the large chunk scale and the small chunk scale. And then we have the large chunk size and the small chunk size, and that'll change the individual size. Then we also have the different colors. So we have color 1, and then we also have color 2. Then we have the roughness of the material, and then we just have the chunks bump strength, the noise bump strength, and then also the tiles bump strength. Then we have the next one here, so this is the terrazzo tile 2, and for this one we have the scale, then we also just have the tile scale, and then we have the chunk scale, then we have this noise scale, so you can kind of change the noise. You can see there's kind of like this whitish and bluish color, so you can change the noise there. Then you can also change all the different colors, so we have colors 1, 2, and 3. Then we also have this noise bump scale, we also have the roughness of the material, and then again we have all 3 of the bumps, so we have the chunks bump strength, the noise bump strength, and then also the tiles bump strength. And then also here's the next one. So this is pretty cool. It kind of has some larger ones with some smaller kind of brownish ones. So for this one, we have the overall scale, then we just have the tile scale, and then we have the large chunk scale, and then we also have color 1 and color 2. Then we have the medium and the small chunk scale, and then we have color 3 and color 4, which are those colors for the smaller chunks. Then we have the large chunk size, we also have the medium chunk size and the small chunk size to change the individual size. Then we have the roughness of the material, and then again we also have the bumps. Then we have this one here, and this one is probably my favorite. I really like how this one looks. So for this one, we have the overall scale. Then we just have the tile scale, and we have this cool distortion value. So this one, you can kind of change this to make it look maybe more like a marble or something. And then we have the different colors, so colors 1 and 2, and you can really change these colors a lot to get a really cool variation. So you could maybe have like a bluish and reddish one. Then we also have this color variation scale. So if you want there to be a lot of variation in the color, you can turn this down, or you can turn it up. And you can see there's like some bigger parts where there's a lighter color, and then in other parts where there's a darker color. And then we have like color 3 and color 4. So for example, you could maybe make this like a reddish color and a bluish color. Then we have the large chunk scale and the chunk size, the medium chunk scale and the chunk size. So the scale is the overall scale of the texture, but then the size is the individual size of each one of those chunks. And then we have the small one as well. And then we also have the roughness and then also the bump strengths. Let's go to the next one here. So this is terrazzo tile 5. So we have the overall scale and the tile scale. And then just like all the others, we have the color. Then we have the color scale. And then we also have the background colors. Then we have the chunk scale, so chunk scale 1 and chunk scale 2. Then we also have the chunks individual size, so you can make them smaller and bigger. And then of course we have the roughness and the bump strength. And then for the last one here, this one doesn't really look like terrazzo tile. It looks more like a cracked marble material, but I think it does look really cool. As I was creating these materials, I just came across this and I thought it looked really cool when I was making the materials, so I just decided to keep it here in the tutorial. But also, if you take the crack's thickness and just turn this way down, maybe turn the crack thickness to like a 1, it looks a lot more like a terrazzo tile material. But for this one, we have the overall scale, and then we also just have the tile scale, and then we have the color scale, and then we have all the different colors. So we have color 1, color 2, and then we also have the cracks color. Then we have the crack scale 1 and crack scale 2, and then of course the crack thickness, which I already mentioned, and then we have the roughness, and then also the bump strengths. So again, if you'd like to purchase these materials to use in your projects, I'll have the links in the description to where you can purchase. But now let's get started with the tutorial. So real quick, I'll show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I have. So I went to the add menu and I just added a cube, and I scaled the cube down by a 0.2 and then pressed Ctrl A and applied the scale, so that's the new default size of the object. Then I went into edit mode and I scaled the object down on the Z axis by a 0.25, hit enter, so that we just have this tile object. Then I'll press Ctrl B to add a bevel, and I'll scroll my mouse wheel so that we have a few cuts there in the bevel. Place that there, and then I can go back to object mode and I'll use the object context menu and shade the object smooth. Then I also added a camera and I just pointed the camera at the objects, and I'll just select this object here and I'll move it over and kind of bring it over to this side, because in the other parts of the tutorial we'll be creating the other tile materials. And also, if you select the camera and go here to the object data properties, I turned the focal length up to 104 just because it zooms the camera in a bit and I like the look of that a bit nicer. Also, if you select the tile object and go to the modifier properties, let's add modifier, and we're going to add the weighted normal node just to kind of sharpen up the edges, and it'll make the shading look nicer. Now, as for the lighting, I added a few different area lights. So this first area light here is kind of on the back, and I set the power to 50 and made it a slightly yellow color. Then we have this other light here, and this is set to 335. And then also we have this light down here, and this one is set to 124. And then I also went over here to the world properties and I added in this brown Photo Studio 04 from polyhaven.com. I'll have the link to it in the description. And I downloaded the 1K version and the HDR version. So once you download the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot here next to color, and you can choose environment texture, and then just click on the open button and open up the HDRI. And then I thought it would be nice if the background is fully black. So what I did is I went over here to the compositing and I clicked on use nodes, and I added an alpha over node, and I put the render layers into the bottom image, and then here on the top image I made it fully black. Then if I go back over here to the shading workspace, I can scroll over here, and if I click on the drop down here on the rendered mode, I'm going to turn the compositor to always, so it renders with the compositing in the viewport, so it's using the real-time compositor. And then also we just need to open up the film tab here and check mark the transparent button so the background is transparent, so now you can see it looks all black. And then also, to make the colors look a bit nicer, here on the color management, I'm going to be using the View Transforma Filmic, and I'll set the look to very high contrast. So I'm in the shading workspace, so the 3D viewport's right over here. Let me just make this smaller and kind of zoom in here, and I'll select the object, and then I have the shader editor right over here. So I'll click on new to add a new material, and I'll just rename this material Terrazzo Tile. And I'm actually going to rename this material to Terrazzo Tile 1 because we're creating 6 materials in this Blender file. And then I'll also be using the Node Wrangler add-on in the video. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on Edit, you can go to the Preferences, and then over here on the Add-ons tab, if you go to the search, just search for Node Wrangler and just enable the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So I'm going to start off by adding a brick texture because we can use the brick texture to make the tiles. So I'll go to the add menu and I'll search for a brick texture. And let's Control Shift and select the brick texture to preview it. And with the brick texture selected, I'll press Control T, and that's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I want to use the object coordinates, so we'll put the object into the vector, and the object coordinates will place the texture on the object more evenly. So now let's change the brick texture settings. So I'm first going to turn the offset all the way up to 1 so it doesn't look like bricks, but it looks more like tile. And then also let's make color 1 fully white, and color 2 we're going to make fully black. Then we can change the scale. So on the scale here, I'm going to turn this to a 1.25, just a 1.25. And then on the mortar size, I'm going to turn this to a 0.001. And then down here on the row height, I want to also turn this to a 0.5 so that the brick width and the row height are the same size. Now I want this to just be the size of one tile. So what we're going to do is move the X and Y locations just to move it over. So on the location X and Y, we're going to turn these both to a 0.2, and that's going to move it over. So you can see what it's doing is we're bringing it over here to the side. But then of course we can scale this down if we want to see more of the tiles. Now there's a problem here. If I zoom in, you can see that it looks a little bit black here. That's because I need to go into edit mode, and I'm just going to scale this object up just a little bit. You can see if I scale up more, we can see more of the tiles. So I'm just going to scale it by a very small amount so that it is white. So now you can see the edge of the tiles is on the edge there of that cube. So now I want to add a noise texture. So I'll go to the add menu and I'll search for a noise texture. Let's drop it here, and I'll control shift and select the noise texture, preview it. And I can change some of these settings. So I'll turn the scale to an 8, also turn the detail to an 8 as well, but then I'll leave the other settings how they are. Now we're going to use this noise texture to distort the little chunks that we're going to make. So what we want to do is eventually put the noise texture into some other Voronoi textures, which we're going to use to make the chunks. But I also want to mix the tiles into the texture. So we're going to be putting the brick texture into the noise. And what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that the noise texture is randomly placed at different positions per tile. So let's box select these nodes and bring them back, and I'll bring the noise texture down here. And I'm going to go to the add menu and I'm going to search for another mapping node. Let's put the mapping here. And then the mapping vector can go into the vector of the noise. Now we're going to bring the brick texture down, and we're going to take this mapping here from the texture coordinate, and we're going to put that into the vector of the mapping, because we're going to be using these scale values to change the size of the entire material. So we want this mapping to be going into this mapping vector. Now to make the noise texture have random placement per tile, we're going to take the brick texture color and we're going to put this into the location of the mapping. And this way, now if I just scale the tiles so you can see it bigger, basically because this brick texture color is going into the mapping location, the different colors of the brick texture are randomly going to move the noise texture around. So that way you can see that the noise texture is different per tile. So there's like kind of a darker part here, but then it's white over here on this tile, and then this tile is kind of a gray color. But I'll turn this scale value, the brick texture scale, back to the default of 1.25. That's what I want to use as the default scale of this, because that's going to be the scale of this tile. But this way, each tile is going to have a different noise position. So I'll box select these nodes, and I'll press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame. I like to use frames just to keep the nodes nicely organized. We'll select the frame, and we'll press F2 to add a label, and I'm going to call this mapping, just to keep the nodes nicely organized. So these are the mapping nodes. Now I want this noise texture to be distorting some Voronoi textures, which are going to be those chunks there in the tiles. So let's go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture. Let's drop it here, and I can Control Shift and select it to preview it. Now we're going to click on the F1 here, and we're going to change this to distance to edge instead, and this is what we're going to use to make those chunks. So I'm going to turn the scale here to a 40, but then I'll leave all the other settings how they are. And then I want to make it more contrasty, so I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a color ramp. I'll put this after the Voronoi texture, and then we're going to drag the black tab out and drag the white tab out to make it more contrasty. So I'll drag the black tab over here, and the white tab kind of about there. Now we have those chunks. Now those chunks do look a little bit small right now, but once we use the object coordinates and plug it up to the mapping, they're going to be bigger. Now what I also want to do is be able to change the size of the individual chunks. So if I search for a hue saturation value and put this between the Voronoi and the color ramp, we can now drag the value, and that's going to make the texture lighter and darker. So that's going to change the size of each individual chunk. So I'll box select these nodes, I'll hit Ctrl J to join it into a frame, I'll select the frame and press F2 to add a label, and I'll just call this large chunks. So let's box select these nodes and drag them back a bit, and I can drag this down here, and I'll box select all the nodes, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate, and I'll drop the large chunks right down here. And this one, instead of calling it large chunks, I'm going to call it small chunks. And then for this, the only thing that I'm going to do is change the scale here to 55, but I'll leave the other settings how they are. So you can see we have larger chunks and smaller chunks. So now I'm going to put the noise texture into these Voronois to distort them. So I'll box select these nodes and drag them back here so we have a bit more space. And I can take the noise texture factor and let's put that into the vector of both of these Voronois. But now you can see it's way too distorted, so to make the noise texture have less of an effect over the Voronois, we're going to search for the mix color. We'll put the mix color node down here, and we want to put the mix results into both vectors of these Voronois. Now the noise texture factor is going to go into color B, and we can now take this mapping vector right here, and this one is after the brick texture, so that way it's going to be different per tile. Whereas if we use this one, it wouldn't be different per tile, but I want to use this mapping vector because the brick texture is changing where it is. noise. So we'll put the vector into color A. So now I can drag the factor around to make it more distorted or less distorted. So you can see if I turn it to 0, it's not distorted at all. So I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.03 just so it's distorted a little bit. So now if I zoom in there, you can see the edges look just a little bit distorted. And also, let's click on the mix type here, and I want to change it to linear light because that way it's going to work a bit better. So you can see it's a bit distorted on the edges. And if I drag the factor, it's distorting it, but it's not quite moving it around quite so much. But that also makes the edges look quite a bit more distorted, and that looks better. So we'll box select the noise texture and the linear light. I'll press Ctrl J to join it together into a frame. I'll press F2 to add a label, and I'll just call this distortion. So we still have the large chunks and the small chunks, and we want to mix them together. So let's go to the add menu, and we're going to search for a mix color and put this after the large chunks and the small chunks. And on the mix type, we're going to change the type to lighten just so it adds the light value. And we can now put the top one into color A, and then the bottom one, let's put that into color B, and we'll Control Shift and select the light to preview it. So now you can see as I turn up the factor, it's going to add those smaller chunks there, and I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.7, so it adds them, but they're going to be slightly darker. So now I want to make the custom colors, so after the lighten, we're going to duplicate this and drop it here, so we have another one, and on lighten, I'll change it back to mix, just so that we're mixing the colors together. And I can take the lighten result and I can put that into the factor. So this way the light and dark values are determining what parts will be color A and what parts will be color B. So now for color A, this one is going to be a lighter color, and the hex value, if you want to use the same color that I'm using, the hex value will be 6E7371. And then for the darker color, this one, if you want to use the hex value, it's going to be 404040. And this factor here is going to add more of those other chunks or less of them. So I'm just turning it to a 0.7 so they're more of a gray color. So now the mixed result can go into the base color, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Let's also box select these two nodes here. I'll press Ctrl J to add a frame, and I'll add a label, and I'm just going to call this color. And then to make it really shiny, because it's going to be a tile material, we'll turn the roughness way down to like a 0.2. So now I want to add in some bumps, so I'll go to the add menu, and we're going to search for a bump node, and we'll drop this down here. And I first want to take this lighten result here, and I'm going to put that into the height value to convert it to bump data. So if I Control Shift and select the bump, you can see this is what it's doing. So let's put the normal into the normal of the shader, and I'll Control Shift and select it to preview it, so you can see it's really bumpy. Now I want them to be going back in slightly instead of coming out, so I'll click on the invert button, and then it's way too strong, so here on the strength, I'm going to turn this to a 0.04, so it is very, very subtle. But you can turn that up more if you want it. Now I do also want to add 2 more layers of bump, some noise, and then also the tiles. So we'll duplicate the bump and drop it here, and then duplicate it again and drop it here, so we have 3 of them. And the normal is going into the normal, so we now have this extra height value that we can add data into. So for the second one here, I just want to add a bit of noise over the surface. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'll search for a noise texture and drop it down here. And then let's go back over here to the mapping, and we want to take this second mapping here. We're going to drag this all the way over here and stick it into the vector of the noise. And then also, if you want to, you can hold down the shift key and right click and drag over the wire and let go to add a reroute. And you can drag the reroute over here just to keep the nodes more organized and the wires more organized. So let's Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it, and I can change some of the settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 30, and I'll turn the detail up a little bit to like a 6, and then I'll leave the other settings how they are. So now the noise texture factor can go into the height value, and I can Control Shift and select the bump to preview it. And I don't want to use the invert, so let's turn that off. And then here on the strength value, I'm going to turn this to a 0.015. So it is very, very subtle because I don't want it to be pretty smooth, but you can of course turn it up more if you want to. So let's Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now the last one that I want to add is the tiles. So let's go over here to the mapping, and we can Control Shift and select the brick texture, and you can see the factor is just going to be a black and white value. So we're going to take the brick texture factor, and let's put that into the height value of this bump, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now it's a little bit hard to see right now because it's on the edge, so if I zoom in here you can kind of see it, but if I just go back over here to the brick texture, we can turn up the scale, and you can see now it looks a little bit bumpy. But here on the bump, I want to make it a bit stronger, so I'm going to turn the strength up to a 0.5, and I will keep it inverted. I think it looks better if it's inverted. So now if I go back to the brick texture and turn up the scale, you can see right there's a little bit of bump there on that tile edge. But I'll leave the scale at a 1.25. So that is it for the first material. So let's now join it together into a node group. So I'll box select all the nodes except the material output, and I'll press Ctrl G to join together into a node group. I'll hit the tab key to go out of the node group, and I'll drag the node group over here, and then let's drag it out to make it bigger, and I can copy the material name and paste it here into the node group. Then I'll hit the tab key to go back into the node group, and I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel, and if you go to the group tab, you can see there's the group sockets here, and I'm going to double click on this and I'll rename it to shader because I like that better. So now if I go over here to the side, we have this group input, and we can plug values up to the group input, and then that way we can control them outside of the node group. Now this mapping node here is plugged up to all the textures, so this scale value will change the size of the entire material. So we'll put the scale into the extra socket. Let's click on the scale here, and you can see it's still 3 values, but I just want it to be 1 value instead. So on the type here, we're going to change the vector to float instead, and then we need to turn the default value back to 1. Let's go out of the node group, and I need to turn the scale back to 1. So now we can go back into the node group. Now I also want to just be able to control the tiles scale, so we can take the brick texture scale, we'll put that into the extra socket, double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to tiles scale. Then I want to control the size of the chunks, so we'll drag the group input way over here next to the Voronoi, and we can take the first scale, put that into the extra socket, and the second scale, put that into the extra socket, and I'll rename this one to large chunk scale, and then this other one here, I'm going to rename this one to small chunks scale. And then also the value here on the hue saturation values are going to control the size of each one, so I'll put the value into the extra socket, and then this other value, put that into the extra socket, and then this one I'll rename to large chunks size, and then this one I'll rename to small chunks size. So you can see this one is controlling the entire texture, and then this one is controlling the other entire texture. Then these ones here, these are controlling the individual scale of each one of those chunks. So let's go back into the node group. Now the group input accidentally got put here in the frame here, so I can just press Alt P just to bring it out of the frame. We'll drag this over here, and we can now put the color A here from this mix into the extra socket, and color B into the extra socket, and then you can just rename these. So I'll just rename it to color 1, and then also color 2, or you could also rename it like chunks color or whatever you want to call it. Then I want to control the roughness of the material, so we'll drag this over here. Let's put the roughness into the extra socket. It's already renamed to roughness. And then I want to control the bump strengths. So this first bump strength here, that's controlling the chunks. So we'll put the strength into the extra socket. Let's double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to chunks bump strength. Then the second one here is the noise, so I'll put that into the extra socket. Let's rename this one to noise bump strength. And then this last one here, this is controlling the tiles. You can kind of see it there on the edge. So we'll put the strength into the extra socket, and let's rename this to tiles bump strength. All right, let's drag the group input way over here at the very end of the node group. Let's hit the N key to close the side panel, and I'll hit the tab key to go outside of the node group. So we have the overall scale, then we just have the tile scale, and you can see that each one of those tiles is going to have a random position for those chunks there and for the noise and everything. So that's the tile scale. We also have the large chunks, the small chunks, and then each one of the chunk sizes. And then we also have the different colors here. So color 1, and then we also have color 2. Then we have the roughness of the material, and then we have the bump strength, so the chunks, and the noise, and also the tiles bump strength. So that's it for the first material, so let's create the next one. So let's create the second terrazzo tile material. So I'm just going to select this object, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and then we're going to move it down on the Y-axis, and we'll just bring it right down here. And then I will delete this material. Let's also go into the rendered viewport mode so we can see this in the rendered view, and we're going to add a new material, and this one I'll call terrazzo tile 2. Now, because this is also going to be a tile material, I'm just going to copy the same mapping nodes that we have from the previous material. So I'm going to select the other material, and I'll go into edit mode. And what I'm going to do is select the texture coordinate, and then hold down the shift key and select the mapping and the brick texture and this other mapping here, and then also shift select the mapping group. And I'll press Ctrl C to copy those nodes. Then I'll click on the other material and press Ctrl V to paste those nodes. So we now have them here, and that's what we can use as the base. So we're using the brick texture to get that tiled look. So now let's create the base of the texture. So I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture, drop it here. And then also underneath this, I'm going to search for a noise texture. I will drop this down here. And I can plug the mapping vector up to the vector of the Voronoi and the vector of the noise texture. So let's Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture, preview it, and then we can change the settings. So here on the F1, I'm going to change it to distance to edge, so we have that crack texture. And then I'm going to turn the scale way up to like a 40. And then this roughness here, I'll turn up to like a 5.7. Now let's Control Shift and select this noise texture to preview it, and I'll change these settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to a 28. And then I'll also turn the detail to 4, and then I'll leave the other settings how they are. So now these two nodes here, I want to mix them together. So we have a Voronoi and a noise. So what I'm going to do is hold down the Shift key and select both of the textures, and I'll press Control 0, and that is going to add this mix color. We'll drag the mix color up here. Now in the mix type, I want to change this to linear light instead. And now I can drag the factor around, and you can see that now the noise is distorting the Voronoi. So I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.4 so we get this cool look. So now you can see there is the Voronoi there, but there's a lot of noise all around it. And then I want to make it really contrasty, so let's add a color ramp, and we're going to put the color ramp between the mix and the principled shader. So just drop it here, and then we can drag the black tab over and the white tab over to make it really, really contrasty. So we'll put the black tab here, and the white tab kind of to about there. So now let's box select these nodes and join them together into a frame, and I'll add a label to the frame, and I'll just call this chunk. Now we can also put this into the bump, so let's take the color ramp color and we'll put that into the normal, and then I want to add a bump node, so we'll search for the bump node and drop it here, and we want the color to going into the height value of the bump. That way if I Control Shift and select the principled shader, you can see it's converting it to bump data, so it looks really bumpy. And I'm going to invert it so that it's going back in instead of popping out, and then on the strength here I'm going to turn it to a very small number of like a 0.02, so it is very subtle. But in the custom node group, you'll be able to make that stronger if you want to. So now let's make the texture for the color. So I will search for a noise texture and we'll drop it up here. And I can take the vector of the mapping. We'll put that into the vector of the noise texture. And then let's Control Shift and select it to preview it. And I'll change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale to 30. And I'll turn the detail all the way up to the max of 15. And I'll turn the roughness up to a 0.6. So we're going to be using this to make the main color, which will be going into the chunks. So now I want to make it more contrasty, so I'm going to add a color ramp, and we'll drop this here after the noise. And if I drag the black tab and white tab really close together, it's going to be very contrasty, and that's exactly what I want, so I'll drag it to about there, so it's really contrasty. Then I want to make the two custom colors. So to do this, I'm going to search for a mix color, and we'll put the mix color here after the color ramp, and the color ramp color is going to go into the factor of the mix here. So now for color A, this first color is going to be kind of like a purpley bluish color. And then for color B, this is just going to be like a grayish color. And if you want to use the same colors I'm using, for color A, the hex value is going to be 6F74C0. And for color B, the hex value for this one is going to be B2, B2, B2. So I'll box select these nodes and I'll join them together into a frame, and I'll add a label to the frame, and I'll just call this color. Now I also want to mix in the chunks texture so that it's kind of dark around the chunks, and then the chunks texture, that's going to have this color here. So what we're going to do is duplicate the mix, and we're going to drop it here, and we're going to take this color ramp here from the chunks, and we're going to put that into the factor. Then we're going to take this mix result here, and we're going to put this into color B. So now if we take color A and make it a really dark color, you can see that's going to be the background color, and then this mix here, that's going to be the color of the chunks. And the hex value that I'll be using for this color is going to be 242E3E. So now we have a cool texture. So let's take the mix result, and I can put that into the base color, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Let's also turn the roughness down to like a 0.2 so it's much more reflective. So now I want to add just a little bit of noise over the surface to make it look slightly bumpy. So right down here, I'm going to search for another noise texture. We'll drop it down here, and the mapping vector can go into the vector of the noise texture. Let's Control Shift and select the noise texture, preview it, and I'll change these settings. So I'm going to turn the scale up pretty high to like a 70, and I'll turn the detail to the max of 15, and I'll turn the roughness to a 0.6. So let's now select the bump here, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and we'll drop this other bump here. We can take this noise texture factor, and let's put that into the height value of this bump, and then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. And I'm also going to hold down the Shift key and right click and drag over this wire and let go, and that's going to add a reroute, and I'll just stick the reroute down there. Now for this bump node here, I'm going to turn off the invert because I don't want to invert it, and then I just want to keep it at a very small number of 0.02 because I don't really want it to be that bumpy, but you could turn this up if you want it to look really rough on the surface. Now I also want to have some little darker areas in the color, so I'm going to take the noise texture and put that into the base color. So we'll select this mix color and I'll duplicate it and drop it here so we have another one, and then I can take the reroute here, which is just that noise, and I can put this into the factor of this mix color. Then we're going to take this mix result here, the one before it, and we're going to put that into color B. So now color A, we can just make this fully black, and that way it's going to add a bit of noise all over the material. So you can see here it is before and then here it is after, so we're just adding a little bit of noise all over the color. So we can finally, of course, put that into the principled shader just to add a little bit more noise. And then also we can plug the tiles into the bump. So we'll select the bump node and we'll duplicate it one more time and stick it here. And we can take this brick texture factor. This is going to be the tiles texture. And we can put that into the height value of the bump. And then I'm also going to invert it so that it looks like it's going back in instead of popping out. So I'm going to invert it. And then also I'm going to turn the strength here to like a 0.5 so it is a bit more bumpy. That is it for the procedural material. So let's join it together into a node group. So I'm going to box select all the nodes except the material output. And I'll press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group. And then I'll hit the tab key to go outside the node group. And I'll drag the node group over here. And I can just drag it out to make it bigger. And then I'll copy the material name and I'll paste it here into the node group. Let's hit the tab key to go into the node group, and I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel. And here in the group sockets, I'll just rename this to shader, and this is over here on the group tab. So I'll rename that to shader because I just like how that looks better outside of the node group. Let's also go over here to this side, and here on the group input, we can plug values up to the group input to control them outside of the node group. So the first value that I want to add is the overall scale, and this mapping node is plugged up to all the textures. So it's going to control the size of the entire material. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket here, and then if I click on the scale, I just want to make it one value. So on the type here, instead of it being vector, I'm going to change it to float instead, and then I need to turn the default value back to 1, and then if I hit tab to go out of the node group, I need to turn the scale back to 1. So let's go back into the node group. Now I also want to control the tile scale. So on this brick texture, we have this scale to change the size of those tiles. So let's put the scale into the extra socket here, and I'll just rename this to tile scale. Now I also want to control the chunk scale. You can see we have this Voronoi and this noise, and both of these are controlling the chunk scale. Now I can't just plug this scale value and this scale value into the same socket because they're separate values. So what I'm going to do is box select these nodes and bring them back a bit, and then what I'm going to do is search for another mapping node. So we'll add another mapping node and we'll put this here after the Voronoi, and then we'll take this vector and we're going to put that into the vector this noise here. So now this mapping node, we can stick it into the chunks, and this mapping node will control the Voronoi scale and the noise texture scale at the same time by using this scale value. So now I can take this mapping scale and we're going to drag this over here and plug it into the extra socket. And then I can click on this scale and I can change the vector back to float so it is one value. And then if I click on the default value, let's turn that to 1, and I can go out of the node group and I need to turn the scale back to 1. But now you can see that's changing the size of those chunks. So we'll go back into the node group, and I will double click on this and I'll just rename it to chunks scale. Then I want to control the noise color scale. So if I drag the node group right up here, you can see there's this noise texture scale, and that's changing the noise of the colors. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to noise color scale. Then I want to control the colors, so I'll drag the node group over here. We can take color A here from this mix, put that into the extra socket, as well as color B into the extra socket. Let's rename these, so I'll rename it to color 1, and then also this one I'll rename to color 2, and then this color here, this is the background, or the color in the back, so I'll take color A here and put that into the extra socket, and then this I'll rename to background color. And then if you wanted to, you could add this black value in here, but I don't really want to do that because you can see turning it up is just going to kind of blow out the texture. You can't really see it that well, so I'm just going to leave it as fully black, and I'm not going to plug it into the node group. Then I want to control the noise, which is controlling the bump. So let's take the group input and drag it way down here. We can take this noise texture scale and put that into the extra socket. And this one is adding a little bit of bump to the surface. So let's double click on this to rename it, and I'll just call it noise bump scale. Then I want to control the roughness and the bump strengths. So let's drag this over here, and I can first take the roughness, put that into the extra socket, and then this first bump here, you can see that is the chunks. So we'll put this into the extra socket, and this one I'll call chunks bump strength. And this second one here, you can see that's just some overall noise. So we'll put the strength into the extra socket, and I'll rename this one to noise bump strength. And then this last one here, this is controlling the tiles. So we'll put the strength into the extra socket, and this one I'll double click on it to rename it, and I'll rename it to tiles bump strength. All right, I'll drag the node group way over here back at the starting. Maybe just drag this over here, and I'll hit the N key to close the side panel, and I'll hit the Tab key to go outside the node group. So we can now just review this final material. So we have the overall scale to change the size of the entire material. Then we just have the tile scale. We also just have the chunk scale, and then we also have that noise color scale. And then we have all the different colors. So we have color 1. And then this one here, this is a white color, that's color 2. And then we also have the background color, and I actually need to drag this out a bit so I can fully read that background color. And turning it up and making it kind of light also does look pretty cool. That looks kind of cool as well. Then we have the noise bump scale, we also have the roughness of the material, and then we have the chunks bump strength, the noise bump strength, and then also the tiles bump strength. And so with that material finished, this is going to wrap up part 1 of creating these terrazzo tile materials. So in part 2 and part 3, we're going to be creating 2 more materials in each part. So we'll have a total of 6 different materials. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. And again, if you'd like to purchase all the project files to get all these materials, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page in the Blender Market. I'll have the links in the video description. You can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to purchase all of my materials. And to learn how to create more materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist here on YouTube. The links are in the description. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in part 2.